In the grand halls of Westmere Palace, where protocol dictates every breath and tradition governs every heartbeat, some moments transcend all rules. What happens when a woman who has spent years perfecting the art of royal composure finally speaks the words that have been locked away in her heart? When duty and love collide in the most unexpected way, even princes can be rendered speechless. This is the story of Catherine and Prince Alexander, a tale that proves sometimes the most powerful words are those we almost never say. The morning sun filtered through the towering windows of Westmere Palace, casting long shadows across the marble floors that had witnessed centuries of royal history. Catherine Ashford moved through the East Wing corridor with a practiced grace that had become second nature to her over the past 8 years. Her heels clicked softly against the polished stone, a rhythm that had become as familiar to the palace staff as the chiming of the great clock tower. But today was different. Today, Catherine carried with her a leather portfolio that contained documents that would change everything. Her formal request for transfer to the embassy in Vienna, effectively ending her role as Prince Alexander's senior diplomatic advisor and closest confidant. Catherine had spent sleepless nights crafting the carefully worded resignation letter hidden within those documents. Each word had been chosen with precision, each sentence structured to maintain the professional distance that protocol demanded, even as her heart screamed the truth she could never officially acknowledge. The truth was that Catherine Ashford, daughter of a respected but modest diplomatic family, had committed the ultimate breach of royal protocol. She had fallen desperately, hopelessly in love with Prince Alexander Edmund Westmere, second in line to the throne and the most eligible bachelor in the kingdom. It had not happened suddenly. Love, Catherine had learned, was rarely the dramatic thunderbolt described in romantic novels. Instead, it had crept into her life like dawn breaking over the palace gardens, so gradually that by the time she recognized it for what it was, it had already colored everything she saw. She remembered the exact moment she had acknowledged the truth to herself. It had been during the state visit from the northern provinces, when Prince Alexander had been struck down by a particularly severe bout of influenza. Catherine had found herself making excuses to check on him, bringing tea that he did not request, staying late to organize his schedule so he would have less to worry about upon his recovery. When he had finally returned to full duties, pale but smiling, and had thanked her for her extraordinary dedication during difficult times, Catherine had felt something shift inside her chest. The way he had looked at her, with genuine warmth and what she dared to hope was affection, had made her realize that her feelings had moved far beyond professional admiration. But reality had a way of crushing such hopes with swift efficiency. Catherine was well aware of her place in the palace hierarchy. She was valued, respected, even trusted with matters of great importance. But she was not, and could never be, considered a suitable match for a prince. The gulf between them was not merely one of wealth or status, but of fundamental destiny. Prince Alexander would marry for alliance, for political advantage, for the good of the kingdom. He would choose someone whose bloodline could be traced back through centuries, someone who had been groomed from birth for the role of future queen. Catherine had spent months trying to convince herself that she could continue in her position, that she could bury her feelings deep enough to function professionally. She had told herself that the occasional moments when their hands brushed over documents, the times when he sought her opinion on personal matters, the way his eyes lingered on her face when he thought she was not looking, she had told herself that these meant nothing. The breaking point had come 3 weeks ago, during the annual Harvest Festival celebration. Catherine had been standing in the grand ballroom, watching Prince Alexander dance with Lady Victoria Pemberton, a stunning duchess from the Southern Territories who possessed everything Catherine lacked: noble blood, vast wealth, and the kind of ethereal beauty that made men forget their own names. As Catherine watched them move together across the polished floor, she had seen the future with painful clarity. Lady Victoria's laugh tinkled like silver bells. Her golden hair caught the light from the crystal chandeliers, and her movements possessed the effortless elegance that came from years of the finest instruction. She was everything a prince's bride should be. But what had truly shattered Catherine's heart was the expression on Prince Alexander's face. He was smiling, genuinely smiling, in a way that Catherine had seen only rarely. He looked relaxed, happy even, as he guided Lady Victoria through the intricate steps of the traditional waltz. That night, Catherine had returned to her modest apartments in the palace's staff quarters and had written the first draft of her transfer request. She had tore it up before dawn, but she had written another the next day and another the day after that. Each version had been more polished than the last, until she had crafted something that she could submit without revealing the true reason for her departure. Now, as she approached the ornate doors of Prince Alexander's private study, Catherine felt the weight of finality settling over her like a shroud. In less than an hour, she would hand over the documents that would begin the process of removing herself from his life forever. She would cite career advancement opportunities, the valuable experience of international diplomacy, her desire to serve the crown in new capacities. All of it would be true, in a way, but none of it would be the whole truth. The whole truth was that she could no longer bear to be near him, knowing that every conversation might be leading to the moment when he would ask her to help plan his wedding to another woman. The truth was that she had to leave before she did something foolish that would destroy not only her own reputation, but potentially damage his as well. Catherine paused outside the study door, her hand raised to knock, and allowed herself one final moment of weakness. She closed her eyes and remembered the first time Prince Alexander had really looked at her, not as an advisor or a staff member, but as Catherine. It had been during her second year at the palace, when she had presented a particularly complex trade proposal that had taken her weeks to research and develop. He had listened intently as she explained the intricate details, his dark eyes never leaving her face. When she had finished, he had been quiet for a long moment before saying, "Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. How did you think to approach it from that angle?" The genuine admiration in his voice had made her heart skip, but it was what happened next that had planted the first seeds of her downfall. He had stood up from behind his massive oak desk, walked around to where she was sitting, and had placed his hand briefly on her shoulder as he said, "Catherine, I hope you know how much I value not just your work, but your insights. You see things others miss." His hand had lingered for perhaps 3 seconds longer than was strictly proper, and in those 3 seconds, Catherine had felt the wall she had built around her heart begin to crumble. Now, standing outside his door 6 years later, Catherine wondered if he had ever suspected the effect that simple gesture had had on her. She wondered if he knew that she had replayed that moment thousands of times, that she had treasured every similar instance when he had treated her as more than just another palace employee. She straightened her shoulders, smoothed down the navy blue dress she had chosen specifically because it was professional yet flattering, and knocked firmly on the door. "Enter," came Prince Alexander's familiar voice from within. Catherine pushed open the heavy door and stepped into the study that had become as familiar to her as her own apartment. Prince Alexander was seated behind his desk, but he looked up immediately as she entered, and she caught something in his expression that made her pause. He looked tired, she realized, more tired than she had seen him in months. There were shadows under his dark eyes, and his usually impeccable hair looked as though he had been running his hands through it. "Catherine," he said, and there was something in the way he spoke her name that made her heart clench. "Please sit down. I was hoping you would come by this morning." She settled into the leather chair across from his desk, the same chair where she had sat for hundreds of meetings over the years. The morning light streaming through the tall windows behind him created a subtle halo effect around his dark hair, and Catherine found herself memorizing the sight, knowing that these might be among the last quiet moments they would share. "Your Highness," she began, falling back on the formal address they used when others might overhear, though they were completely alone. "I have some documents that require your attention." But Prince Alexander was not looking at the portfolio in her lap. Instead, his gaze was fixed on her face, and there was an intensity there that made her breath catch. "Catherine," he said again, and this time her name sounded almost like a question. "Before we discuss any official business, there is something I need to tell you." Something I should have said long ago. Catherine felt her carefully constructed composure begin to waver. There was something in his tone, something in the way he was looking at her, that suggested this conversation was not going to follow the script she had rehearsed. "Your Highness," she managed to say, though her voice sounded strange to her own ears. Prince Alexander stood up abruptly, moving to the window where he stood with his back to her for a long moment. When he finally turned around, Catherine was shocked to see that his usual calm demeanor had been replaced by something that looked remarkably like nervousness. "Catherine, do you remember the night of the spring gala 3 months ago?" Of course she remembered. It had been one of those magical evenings when the palace had been transformed into something from a fairy tale, with thousands of white flowers and glittering lights turning the ballroom into an enchanted garden. Catherine had been working late, finalizing the seating arrangements for the diplomatic dinner the following week, when Prince Alexander had found her in her small office near the state dining room. "You should not be working so late," he had said, leaning against her doorframe in a way that was utterly casual and completely unlike his usual formal bearing. "The seating chart needs to be perfect," she had replied, not looking up from her papers. "Lord Ashworth cannot be seated near the ambassador from Millfield, and Lady Catherine's dietary restrictions mean she needs to be placed where she can easily access the alternative menu items." "Lady Catherine?" Prince Alexander had said with amusement. "Are you referring to yourself in the third person now?" Catherine had looked up then, confused, until she realized her mistake. "Oh, no, I meant Lady Catherine Drummond from the Eastern Territories. Sometimes I forget that we share a name." "I never forget," Prince Alexander had said quietly, and something in his tone had made Catherine look up sharply. He had been watching her with an expression she could not quite read, but before she could analyze it further, he had straightened up and resumed his formal bearing. "In any case, you should get some rest. The work will still be here tomorrow." But he had not left immediately. Instead, he had walked into her small office and had picked up one of the family photographs on her desk, a picture of Catherine with her parents and younger brother at her university graduation. "You look happy here," he had observed. "I was," Catherine had replied. "It was a good day. My parents were so proud, and James had just gotten accepted to medical school. Everything seemed possible." Prince Alexander had set the photograph down carefully, but his eyes had remained on her face. "Do you miss it? That feeling that everything is possible?" The question had caught Catherine off guard with its unexpected depth. "Sometimes," she had answered honestly. "Do you?" He had smiled then, but it had been a sad sort of smile. "I think I never had it to begin with. When you are born to a particular destiny, possibility becomes a luxury you learn to live without." Catherine had wanted to say something comforting, something wise, but before she could find the words, footsteps in the corridor had broken the intimate spell of the moment. Prince Alexander had immediately stepped back, putting proper distance between them, and had bid her a formal good night. But Catherine had not forgotten the conversation or the way he had looked at her when he spoke about destiny and possibility. Now, months later, as Prince Alexander asked if she remembered that night, Catherine felt her heart begin to race. "Yes," she said simply. "I remember. I have thought about that conversation many times since then," he said, moving closer to where she sat. "About what you said regarding everything seeming possible, and about what I said regarding destiny." Catherine gripped the portfolio containing her transfer request more tightly, sensing that whatever Prince Alexander was building toward, it was going to make her carefully planned departure infinitely more complicated. "Your Highness," she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. "Please," he said, "let me finish. I have been thinking about possibility and destiny for months now, Catherine. I have been wondering if perhaps I was wrong to accept so readily that my path was fixed and unchangeable." He was standing directly in front of her now, and Catherine had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. What she saw there made her breath catch in her throat. "I have been wondering," Prince Alexander continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "if it might be possible to choose love over duty, at least once in my life. If it might be possible to tell someone how I feel about them, even if protocol suggests I should remain silent." Catherine felt the world tilt around her. The portfolio slipped from her numb fingers and fell to the floor, papers scattering across the Persian rug, but she did not notice. All she could see was Prince Alexander's face. All she could hear was the thundering of her own heartbeat. "Alexander," she whispered, forgetting all protocol in her shock. The sound of his name on her lips seemed to break something inside him. He dropped to one knee beside her chair, bringing their faces level, and reached out to gently cup her cheek in his hand. "Catherine," he said, and her name sounded like a prayer. "I need you to know that you are the reason I have begun to believe in possibility again." The words hung in the air between them like fragile crystal, beautiful and terrifying in their implications. Catherine felt as though she had been transported into one of the romantic novels she secretly read in her apartments late at night. Except this was real, achingly real, and infinitely more complicated than any fictional love story. Prince Alexander's hand was still cupping her cheek, his thumb tracing a gentle line along her cheekbone, and Catherine found herself leaning into the touch despite every rational thought screaming at her to pull away. This was madness. This was everything she had dreamed of, and everything she had known could never happen. "Alexander," she breathed again, and she saw something flicker in his dark eyes at the sound of his name without his title. "You cannot mean this." "Cannot?" he asked, and there was a hint of the imperial authority that was his birthright threading through his voice. Or should not. The distinction was crucial, Catherine realized. Cannot implied impossibility, while should not suggested choice. And if this was about choice, both, she said firmly, though her voice shook. "Alexander, you know as well as I do what this would mean." "What would cost?" He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching her face as though he could find answers written there. When he finally spoke, his words surprised her. "Tell me about the portfolio you dropped," he said softly. Catherine's stomach lurched. In her shock at his confession, she had completely forgotten about her transfer request. But now the scattered papers seemed to mock her from where they lay on the rug. She could see the corner of the official letterhead, the formal language that would take her away from him forever. "It is nothing important," she lied, but Alexander had already seen the truth in her expression. He released her face and bent to gather the papers, and Catherine watched with growing dread as his eyes scanned the formal documents. She saw the moment he understood what he was reading, saw his expression shift from confusion to comprehension to something that looked like devastation. "A transfer request," he said quietly, sitting back on his heels. "To Vienna." "Yes," Catherine whispered. "When?" "As soon as possible. Within the month, if arrangements can be made." Alexander was quiet for so long that Catherine began to wonder if he had forgotten she was there. When he finally looked up at her, his expression was carefully controlled, but she could see the hurt he was trying to hide. "How long have you been planning this?" he asked. Catherine wanted to lie, wanted to minimize the betrayal she saw in his eyes, but she had never been able to deceive him successfully. 3 weeks, she admitted. 3 weeks, he repeated slowly. "And in all that time, it never occurred to you to speak to me about your dissatisfaction with your current position?" The formal phrasing stung, but Catherine understood that he was retreating behind the safety of protocol, just as she had done countless times before. It was easier than acknowledging the personal nature of what was happening between them. "It was not dissatisfaction with my position," Catherine said carefully. "It was a career opportunity that I felt I should consider." "Do not lie to me, Catherine." The words were spoken softly, but they carried the weight of years of friendship and trust. "Not now. Not about this." Catherine felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back. She had not cried in front of Prince Alexander in all their years of working together, and she would not start now. "You want the truth?" she asked, and there was more emotion in her voice than she had intended. "The truth is that I cannot stay here any longer, Alexander. I cannot continue to pretend that I feel nothing more than professional admiration for you. I cannot stand by and watch you marry Lady Victoria or whoever else the council deems suitable, knowing that I will be expected to help plan the wedding and smile and congratulate you as though my heart is not breaking." The words tumbled out of her in a rush, years of suppressed emotion finally finding voice. She had not meant to confess so much, but Alexander's own honesty had stripped away her carefully maintained defenses. Prince Alexander stared at her for a long moment, and Catherine watched as a series of emotions crossed his face: surprise, pain, and something that might have been relief. "Lady Victoria," he said finally, and there was an odd note in his voice. "You think I'm going to marry Lady Victoria? Are you not?" Catherine asked, confused by his tone. "The papers have been speculating for months, and she has been invited to every major palace event since the summer. Your mother seems quite taken with her." Alexander laughed, but it was not a happy sound. "Lady Victoria is a lovely woman," he said. "She is intelligent, accomplished, beautiful, and perfectly suitable. She would make an excellent princess and, eventually, a wonderful queen." Each word felt like a dagger to Catherine's heart, but she forced herself to remain composed. "Then, I fail to see why you find the idea amusing." "Because," Alexander said, rising from where he knelt and moving to stand at the window again, "Lady Victoria is in love with someone else. Has been for years, in fact. She has been nothing more than a convenient shield for both of us. She deflects attention from the man she truly loves, and her presence at palace functions has given the press and the council something to write about while I have been trying to figure out how to change the course of my own destiny." Catherine felt the world shift around her again. "What do you mean?" Alexander turned back to face her, and in his expression she saw a vulnerability that he rarely allowed anyone to see. "I mean that for the past year, I have been working behind the scenes to find a way to change the rules of succession, or at least the rules governing royal marriages. I have been consulting with constitutional scholars, with members of parliament, with anyone who might help me understand what options exist for a prince who wants to marry for love rather than political alliance." Catherine's heart stopped. "Alexander, you cannot be serious." "I've never been more serious about anything in my life," he said, crossing the room to kneel beside her chair again. "Catherine, do you think I have spent the last 8 years seeking your counsel on matters of state simply because you were good at your job? Do you think I requested that you be assigned as my permanent advisor because I admire your efficiency?" I assumed," Catherine faltered. "You assumed correctly, in part," Alexander said with a small smile. "You are brilliant at what you do, Catherine. You see solutions where others see only problems. You understand the nuances of international relations better than diplomats with twice your experience. And you have an instinct for strategy that has made you invaluable to the crown." Catherine felt a flush of pride at his words, but she could sense that there was more coming. "But beyond all of that," Alexander continued, "you are the only person in this palace who speaks to me as though I am a man first and a prince second. You challenge my ideas. You call me on my mistakes. You make me laugh when the weight of duty becomes too much to bear. You are my closest friend, Catherine, and somewhere along the way, you became the woman I cannot imagine living my life without." The words were everything Catherine had dreamed of hearing, and everything she had feared would destroy them both. She closed her eyes, trying to think clearly, but Alexander's proximity was making rational thought impossible. "Even if everything you say is true," she said slowly, "even if there were some way to change the rules of succession or marriage, the scandal would be enormous. The press would destroy us both, and the damage to the monarchy could be irreversible." "Perhaps," Alexander agreed, "or perhaps the people would be more accepting than we assume. Perhaps they would see that their prince chose to marry for love rather than political advantage, and perhaps they would respect that choice. And if they do not?" Alexander was quiet for a moment, considering her question seriously. "Then we would face the consequences together," he said finally. "Catherine, I'm not asking you to give me an answer today. I am not asking you to make any decisions or promises. I'm simply asking you not to leave. Not yet. Give me time to explore the possibilities, to understand what options we might have." Catherine opened her eyes to find him watching her intently, and she saw in his expression a hope so fragile that it broke her heart. "Alexander," she said gently, "even if the constitutional issues could be resolved, even if the public would accept such a marriage, there is still the matter of what kind of queen I would make. I was not born to this. I was not trained for it. I did not have the background, the connections, the social graces that would be required. You underestimate yourself, Alexander said firmly. You have spent 8 years learning the intricacies of royal protocol. You understand the political landscape better than most people born to it, and you have natural grace that cannot be taught. More than that, you have compassion, intelligence, and integrity. Those are the qualities that make a good queen, Catherine, not bloodline or bank balance. Catherine felt tears threatening again, this time not from sadness, but from the overwhelming nature of what Alexander was suggesting. The idea that she could truly be with him, that they could have a future together, was so wonderful and so terrifying that she could barely process it. "What about your brother?" she asked suddenly. "If you were to marry beneath your station, if there was scandal, how would that affect Marcus and his position as heir?" It was a practical question, but Catherine could see that Alexander had already considered it. "Marcus has always been better suited to be king than I am," he said with a rueful smile. "He was born with the kind of natural authority that I have had to work to develop. If anything, my stepping back from the direct line of succession might be a relief to him. It would mean less pressure, fewer expectations, more freedom to live his own life while still serving the crown." Catherine realized that Alexander had indeed thought through all the angles, had considered all the potential consequences of what he was proposing. This was not some romantic whim or momentary madness. This was a carefully considered decision by a man who understood exactly what he was risking. "Why now?" she asked quietly. "Why are you telling me this now?" Alexander reached for her hands, and Catherine did not pull away when he took them in his larger, warmer ones. "Because I realized that I was about to lose you," he said simply. "Because when I saw that transfer request, I understood that you were planning to leave not for career advancement, but because staying here had become too painful for you. And because I finally understood that all my careful planning and constitutional research would mean nothing if you were on the other side of the world." Catherine looked down at their joined hands, marveling at how right it felt despite how wrong she knew it was supposed to be. "Catherine," Alexander said softly, "I need you to know that regardless of what you decide about us, regardless of whether you choose to stay or go, you have already changed my life in ways you cannot imagine. You have taught me that duty and happiness do not have to be mutually exclusive, that it is possible to serve the crown while still honoring one's own heart." The sincerity in his voice nearly undid her completely. Catherine had spent so many years believing that her love for him was hopeless, that it was something shameful to be hidden and eventually overcome. To hear him speak of it as something beautiful, something that had enriched his life rather than complicated it, was overwhelming. "I do not know what to say," she admitted. "Say that you will not submit that transfer request today," Alexander said. "Say that you will give us, time to see what might be possible." Catherine studied his face, seeing the hope and fear warring there. She thought about the 8 years she had spent at his side, about all the moments of almost unbearable closeness that she had treasured and tried to forget. She thought about the transfer request that would take her away from all of this, away from him to a new life that would be safer but infinitely lonelier. She thought about possibility and about the courage it took to reach for something you wanted even when success was far from guaranteed. "I will not submit the transfer request today," she said quietly. The relief that flooded Alexander's face was so profound that Catherine felt her own eyes fill with tears. He brought her hands to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, and Catherine felt something shift inside her chest, like a door opening after years of being locked. "Thank you," he said, and the words carried the weight of everything he could not yet say. Part 3, the days that followed their conversation felt suspended in time, as though Catherine and Prince Alexander existed in a bubble where normal rules did not apply. To anyone observing them, nothing had changed. They maintained their professional demeanor during official meetings, kept appropriate physical distance during public appearances, and continued to address each other with formal courtesy when others were present. But in the quiet moments between scheduled appointments, when they found themselves alone in his study or walking through the less frequented corridors of the palace, Catherine caught glimpses of a different Alexander, one who let his guard down, who allowed his feelings to show in the way he looked at her, who seemed to find excuses to extend their private conversations. Catherine had not realized how much energy she had been expending on hiding her emotions until she no longer had to do so completely. The relief of honesty, even partial honesty, was intoxicating. When Alexander complimented her work now, she could accept the praise without wondering if she was reading too much into his words. When he sought her opinion on personal matters, she no longer had to carefully modulate her responses to maintain professional distance. It was during one such conversation, exactly 1 week after their revelation in his study, that Catherine began to understand the true complexity of what Alexander was proposing. They had been reviewing correspondence from foreign dignitaries when Alexander had set aside the formal letters and had turned to her with an expression she had learned to recognize as his prelude to a more personal discussion. "Catherine," he had said, "I have been meeting with constitutional experts." Her pulse quickened. "And the good news is that there is precedent for what I want to do. Not recent precedent, but precedent nonetheless." In 1923, Prince Edward of Millbrook married a woman of common birth after renouncing his claim to that nation's throne. The marriage was considered legitimate. Their children were accepted into the royal family. And while there was initial scandal, public opinion eventually shifted to support them. Catherine felt a flutter of hope, but Alexander's expression suggested there was more complicated news to come. "The challenging news," he continued, "is that the process would be neither quick nor simple. Any change to the succession laws would require approval from Parliament, and any royal marriage outside the approved bloodlines would need to be sanctioned by the Church. Both processes could take months, possibly years." "Years," Catherine repeated, trying to process what that would mean for them. "Years during which our relationship would likely become public knowledge," Alexander said gently. "Years during which you would be subject to intense scrutiny from the press and the public. Years during which we would both face criticism, speculation, and probably outright hostility from those who oppose the idea of a royal marrying beneath his station." Catherine sank back in her chair, the reality of what he was describing settling over her like a weight. She had understood intellectually that their relationship would face obstacles, but she had not fully considered what those obstacles would mean in practical, daily terms. "Catherine," Alexander said, leaning forward, "I need you to understand what you would be agreeing to if we pursue this path. Your life would change completely. You would lose your privacy, your anonymity, your ability to move through the world without being recognized and judged. Every choice you make, every word you speak, every dress you wear would be analyzed and criticized. There would be people who would never accept you as suitable for a prince, no matter how you conduct yourself." The honesty in his words was both heartbreaking and necessary. Catherine appreciated that he was not trying to minimize the difficulties they would face, even as part of her wished he would paint a rosier picture of their potential future. "What you're describing," she said slowly, "sounds rather like what any woman marrying into the royal family would face." "True," Alexander agreed, "but most women who marry into royal families have been preparing for that life since childhood. They have been trained in public speaking, in fashion, in the subtle arts of royal diplomacy. They have family connections that ease their entry into royal circles. You would be starting from a very different place." Catherine was quiet for a long moment, considering his words. "Are you trying to discourage me?" she asked finally. Alexander's expression grew pained. "I'm trying to ensure that you understand what you would be choosing," he said. "Catherine, I love you too much to let you enter into this blindly. If we do this, I need to know that you are choosing it with full knowledge of what it will cost." The casual way he said, "I love you," made Catherine's heart skip, even though she had known his feelings for days now. Hearing the words spoken aloud was different, more real, more precious. "And what would it cost you?" she asked. Alexander considered the question seriously. "My relationship with my parents would likely be strained, at least initially. My mother has very firm ideas about appropriate matches for her sons, and you are not what she had envisioned." My father would be concerned about the political implications, about how such a marriage might affect the monarchy's standing with Parliament and the public. And your brother? Marcus would support us, Alexander said with confidence. He has never cared much for royal protocol when it comes to personal matters, and he has always believed that happiness should take precedence over duty when possible. Catherine found herself wondering what it would be like to have Prince Marcus as a brother-in-law, but she pushed the thought aside. It was too soon to think about such things, too presumptuous to imagine herself as part of the royal family. Alexander, she said carefully, have you considered that there might be a middle path? Something less dramatic than changing succession laws and challenging centuries of tradition. He looked at her with curiosity. What do you mean? Catherine chose her words carefully, aware that what she was about to suggest might sound like rejection. I mean that perhaps we could find a way to be together without requiring official recognition. There have been royal relationships throughout history that existed outside the bounds of formal marriage, but were nonetheless meaningful and lasting. She watched Alexander's face as she spoke, and she saw understanding dawn in his eyes, followed by something that looked like disappointment. You are suggesting that I keep you as a mistress, he said quietly. The blunt phrasing made Catherine flinch, but she forced herself to nod. I am suggesting that perhaps love does not always require legal recognition to be real. Alexander was silent for a long time, and Catherine began to worry that she had offended him, that he would see her suggestion as evidence that she did not value herself highly enough to demand marriage. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. Catherine, I understand why that option might seem appealing. It would allow us to be together without the public scrutiny and political complications that would come with marriage. But I cannot ask you to accept such an arrangement. You are not asking, Catherine pointed out. I am suggesting, and I am declining, Alexander said with a sad smile. Catherine, you deserve better than to be hidden away like some shameful secret. You deserve to be acknowledged, celebrated, honored. You deserve to have your relationship recognized and respected, not whispered about in palace corridors. Catherine felt tears prick at her eyes, both from gratitude for his respect and from frustration at the complexity of their situation. Moreover, Alexander continued, such an arrangement would be unfair to you in practical terms. You would have no legal protections, no official status, no security for your future. If something were to happen to me, if political circumstances were to change, you could be cast aside without recourse. Catherine had not considered these practical implications, and the picture Alexander painted was indeed troubling. So what are you saying? She asked. That our only options are official marriage with all its complications, or nothing at all? Alexander reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, a gesture that had become familiar over the past week. I am saying that you deserve nothing less than everything I can offer you, he said. And I am saying that I am willing to fight for that, regardless of how difficult the battle might be. The sincerity in his voice moved Catherine deeply, but it also highlighted the fundamental difference in their perspectives. Alexander was thinking about what he wanted to give her, while Catherine was thinking about what she could realistically accept. Alexander, she said gently, I appreciate your willingness to fight tradition and law for my sake, but I need you to consider the possibility that the costs might outweigh the benefits, not just for you, but for the monarchy itself. If pursuing this relationship were to damage the crown's reputation or weaken its position with the people, could you live with that? It was a question that struck at the heart of Alexander's deepest conflict, the tension between his personal desires and his duty to the crown. Catherine watched as he struggled with it, and she felt a pang of guilt for forcing him to confront such an impossible choice. I have thought about that, he said finally, and I believe that a monarchy that cannot evolve, that cannot reflect the values of its people, is ultimately doomed anyway. The world is changing, Catherine. People are less willing to accept that birth determines worth, less impressed by titles and bloodlines. Perhaps a royal love story, a prince choosing love over political advantage, would strengthen the monarchy rather than weaken it. Catherine wanted to believe him, but years of studying political history had taught her that public opinion was unpredictable and often unforgiving. "And if you are wrong," she pressed. Alexander met her eyes steadily. "Then we will face the consequences together," he said. "Catherine, I cannot promise you that this path will be easy or that it will lead to the outcome we hope for. But I can promise you that whatever happens, you will not face it alone." The weight of his commitment was both comforting and terrifying. Catherine had never been in a relationship where someone was willing to risk so much for her sake, and she found herself wondering if she was worthy of such devotion. "I need time," she said quietly. Alexander nodded. "Of course. This is not a decision to be made hastily." "How much time do we have?" Catherine asked. "Before you need to make official moves, before people start asking questions about why I have not transferred to Vienna?" Alexander considered her question. "A few weeks, perhaps a month. I have already told the Vienna embassy that your transfer is being delayed due to ongoing projects here, but I cannot use that excuse indefinitely." A month. Catherine tried to imagine making such a momentous decision in 30 days, and the prospect was overwhelming. "Alexander," she said, "I want you to know that regardless of what I ultimately decide, these past weeks have been the happiest of my life. Simply knowing that you care for me, that my feelings are not one-sided, it has changed everything for me." Alexander brought her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her palm, a gesture so tender that Catherine felt her eyes fill with tears. "For me as well," he said softly. "Whatever happens, Catherine, I will never regret telling you how I feel." Part for the decision that would change both their lives came not through careful deliberation, but through a moment of crisis that stripped away all pretense and revealed the truth of what they meant to each other. It happened on a Thursday morning in late autumn, when the palace was preparing for the annual Remembrance Day ceremony. Catherine had arrived early to finalize the arrangements for the visiting dignitaries when she was met at the East Wing entrance by James Morrison, Alexander's private secretary, whose face was grave with worry. "Catherine, thank God you are here," he said, his usual composed demeanor cracking. "There's been an accident." Catherine felt the world tilt around her. "Alexander," she whispered. "A riding accident during his morning exercise," James confirmed. "He was thrown when his horse shied at something in the woods. The royal physician is with him now," but Catherine did not wait for him to finish. She dropped her briefcase and ran through the palace corridors with a speed that would have scandalized the staff under normal circumstances, her heels echoing against the marble floors as she made her way to the royal family's private quarters. She burst through the doors of Alexander's suite to find controlled chaos. The royal physician bent over Alexander's still form on the bed, 2 nurses assisting, and Queen Isabella standing by the window with an expression of barely contained terror. Catherine stopped short when she saw the Queen, suddenly, aware that she had no official reason to be there, no right to demand information about Alexander's condition. But before she could retreat, Queen Isabella turned and saw her. "Catherine," the Queen said, and there was something in her voice that Catherine could not identify. "I was hoping you would come." Catherine approached slowly, her eyes fixed on Alexander's pale face. He appeared to be unconscious, and she could see a bandage around his head where blood had seeped through. "How badly is he hurt?" Catherine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Concussion," the royal physician answered without looking up. "Possible internal bleeding. We need to get him a hospital for proper scans, but he's been drifting in and out of consciousness and asking for you." Catherine's heart clenched. "For me? He has said your name several times," Queen Isabella confirmed, studying Catherine with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "Dr. Harrison believes that familiar voices might help keep him oriented." Catherine moved closer to the bed, and without thinking about protocol or propriety, she reached for Alexander's hand. His fingers were cold, and she could see bruises forming along his arms where he had tried to break his fall. "Alexander," she said softly, "can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered, and after a moment, his dark eyes opened and fixed on her face. The relief Catherine felt was so profound that she nearly sobbed. "Catherine," he said, his voice hoarse but clear. "You came." "Of course I came," she said, squeezing his hand. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by a very large horse," Alexander replied with a weak attempt at humor. "Did we miss any important meetings?" Catherine laughed despite her tears. "Nothing that cannot be rescheduled. You need to focus on getting better." "The Remembrance Day ceremony," Alexander said, trying to sit up and wincing at the movement. "Will proceed perfectly without you," Catherine said firmly, gently pressing him back against the pillows. "Marcus can handle the official duties, and I will manage the coordination with the visiting dignitaries." Alexander looked at her for a long moment, and Catherine saw something shift in his expression. "Catherine," he said quietly, "when I was lying on the ground in the woods, when I thought I might be seriously injured, the only thing I could think about was how much I regretted not telling you something important." Catherine glanced nervously at Queen Isabella, who was listening to every word, but Alexander seemed oblivious to anyone else in the room. "What did you regret not telling me?" Catherine asked. Alexander struggled to focus on her face, his concussion making concentration difficult. "That I love you," he said simply. "That I have loved you for years, and that if something happened to me, I needed you to know that you have been the best part of my life." The silence in the room was deafening. Catherine felt her cheeks burn as she realized that Alexander, in his injured and disoriented state, had just declared his love for her in front of his mother and the medical staff. Dr. Harrison cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps we should prepare for the transfer to hospital," he suggested. But Queen Isabella did not move. Instead, she continued to study Catherine with those sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "Dr. Harrison," the Queen said quietly, "would you please give me a few minutes alone with Catherine? You may continue monitoring Alexander, but I would appreciate some privacy for conversation." Catherine felt her stomach drop. She had never been alone with Queen Isabella, and she could think of no good reason why the Queen would want to speak with her now, unless it was to discuss Alexander's inappropriate declaration. Dr. Harrison and the nurses moved to the far side of the room, close enough to monitor Alexander, but far enough to provide the illusion of privacy. Alexander himself seemed to be drifting back toward unconsciousness, his eyes closing as the pain medication took effect. "Catherine," Queen Isabella said, "please sit down." Catherine perched nervously on the edge of a nearby chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "How long?" the Queen asked simply. Catherine knew there was no point in pretending to misunderstand. "I have cared for him for several years, Your Majesty. But we have only recently acknowledged our feelings to each other." Queen Isabella nodded slowly. "I see. And what are your intentions regarding my son?" The direct question caught Catherine off guard. She had expected accusations, demands that she leave the palace immediately, threats about her future employment. She had not expected what sounded almost like a job interview. Your Majesty, I am not certain I understand what you are asking." "I am asking," Queen Isabella said with the patience of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "whether you love my son enough to fight for him." Catherine stared at the Queen, completely unable to process what she was hearing. "Your Majesty," Catherine said carefully, "I think there may be some misunderstanding. Alexander and that is, there is no official relationship between us. I am merely his advisor." Queen Isabella smiled, and it was not an entirely pleasant expression. "Catherine, I have been watching you and Alexander for years. I have seen the way you look at each other when you think no one is observing. I have noticed how his entire demeanor changes when you enter a room, how he seeks your opinion on matters that have nothing to do with your official duties. I have watched my son become a better man under your influence, and I would have to be blind not to see that he is in love with you." Catherine felt exposed, as though all her carefully guarded secrets had been laid bare. "More importantly," the Queen continued, "I have watched you these past years, and I have been impressed by your discretion, your intelligence, and your devotion to Alexander's welfare. You have had numerous opportunities to exploit your position or to use Alexander's obvious affection for you to advance your own interests, and You have never taken advantage of those opportunities. Catherine found her voice. Your Majesty, I would never, I know you would not, Queen Isabella interrupted. That is precisely my point. Catherine, do you know what I want most for my sons? Catherine shook her head, not trusting herself to speak. I want them to be happy, the Queen said simply. I want them to find partners who will challenge them, support them, and love them for who they are rather than what they represent. I want them to have marriages based on mutual respect and genuine affection, not political convenience. Catherine felt tears gathering in her eyes. This conversation was so far from what she had expected that she felt disoriented. Alexander has told me about his research into constitutional changes, Queen Isabella continued. He has consulted with me about the possibility of altering succession laws to allow for marriages outside the traditional bloodlines. He has. Catherine managed to ask. He has. And I have told him that he has my full support, provided that the woman he chooses is worthy of him. Queen Isabella leaned forward slightly, fixing Catherine with that penetrating stare. So, I ask you again, Catherine, do you love my son enough to fight for him? Do you love him enough to endure years of public scrutiny, political opposition, and social challenges? Do you love him enough to become the kind of woman who can stand beside a prince and eventually a king? Catherine looked over at Alexander, who was sleeping peacefully now, his face relaxed and young-looking despite the bandages and bruises. She thought about the years they had spent working together, the countless conversations that had shaped both their minds and hearts, the way he had looked at her when he told her he loved her. She thought about possibility and choice, about courage and compromise, about the difference between the life she had planned and the life she might dare to claim. Yes, Catherine said quietly. I love him enough to fight for him. Queen Isabella smiled, and this time it was warm and genuine. Good, she said, because he will need you to be strong for what comes next. What comes next? Catherine asked. Next, we change the world, Queen Isabella said with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her ability to reshape reality to suit her will. Next, we show the people of this kingdom that love and duty are not mutually exclusive, and that a prince who chooses to marry for love rather than political advantage might actually be exactly what this monarchy needs. Catherine felt a surge of hope so powerful it nearly overwhelmed her. You really think it is possible? I think, Queen Isabella said, that with the right woman beside him, my son could accomplish anything. The question is whether you are ready to become that woman. Catherine looked again at Alexander, at the man she loved who had been willing to risk everything for the chance to build a life with her. She thought about the transfer request that still sat, unsigned, in her apartment. She thought about the choice between safety and possibility, between the life she had planned and the future she had never dared to imagine. I am ready, she said. Queen Isabella nodded with satisfaction. Then, we have much work to do. But first, we need to get Alexander to hospital and ensure that he makes a full recovery. Everything else can wait until he is well enough to participate in planning his own future. As if summoned by his mother's words, Alexander stirred and opened his eyes again. His gaze immediately found Catherine's face, and she saw awareness return to his expression as he remembered what he had said earlier. Catherine, he said, his voice stronger now. Did I say something inappropriate while I was disoriented? Catherine smiled through her tears. You said something honest, she corrected. And what was your response to this honest statement? Alexander asked, glancing nervously between Catherine and his mother. Catherine leaned closer to the bed, close enough that only he could hear her words. My response, she whispered, is that I love you too, and that I am ready to fight for us, whatever that might require. The expression of joy that crossed Alexander's face was so radiant that Catherine knew she had made the right choice. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever battles they would have to fight, they would face them together. Outside the palace windows, the autumn sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. But inside the royal suite, as Catherine held Alexander's hand and felt Queen Isabella's approving gaze upon them, It felt like the beginning of something entirely new, a love story that would rewrite the rules of what was possible for a prince and the woman who had captured his heart. The future was uncertain, filled with obstacles they could not yet imagine and changes they could not yet foresee. But it was also filled with possibility, with hope, and with the kind of love that had the power to transform not just two lives, but an entire kingdom. And for the first time in her life, Catherine Ashford was ready to reach for everything she had ever wanted, consequences be damned.